on this Friday. Okay. It's Friday. Hooray for that. It is a well-earned Friday indeed. So on Wednesday, we had left off talking about some of the core definitions for what makes evolution. And so we had just reminded ourselves ultimately that evolution occurs at the population level. So remember, we see a whole population change from, say, light-colored moths to dark-colored moths, but that an individual doesn't change, right? So in my lifetime, I would not change from a light-colored moth to a dark-colored moth. Okay. So, roadmaps, right? So our goals here, the very beginning of this is probably the things that will feel very familiar. Talking about mechanisms that can cause population changes that are not natural selection, but then really focusing on natural selections. Remember, that is the mechanism that allows for environmental matching. So for us in particular, since we're going to be focusing on the environment as ecology, this is the one that's going to interest us the most. So we're going to spend a little bit of time reviewing what the basics are. So what is it we need for this to occur successfully, okay? And then we're going to focus on really fleshing this out. And we're going to find that there's a lot more, okay, coloring with a crayon here, to this than we saw before, okay? So there's actual types of natural selection instead of just this broad, it happens. Okay, so we'll really get to play with this a little bit. Then we're going to look at, and we've seen this a little bit before, and you guys have talked about this before, the types of natural selection that there is. We have general natural selection. We've already mentioned in class sexual selection, which is its own beast, but follows very similar rules. And then, of course, artificial selection, which is when humans do it to nature. And then we're going to look at the tools and tips that you need to do your assignment, which is looking at evolution with relationships. This is going to look, if you took Zoe with me, a little bit like that very first lab activity we did. So we're going to start applying this to actual organisms and looking at how does this affect evolutionary relationships. That's not what I touched, so thank you. All right, so let's take a peek here. So remember, there are different relationships that do cause changes in population, geno, and phenotypes. Okay, so remember, the genotype is the genetic structure of the way a population looks or acts, right? And the phenotype is the physical expression or manifestation of that. Okay, so genetic drift is one example of that, okay? And ultimately, okay, and this is one of the more common ones, okay, this is when it happens randomly, okay? So it's literally just drifting one way or another. And this does occur to some degree in all populations, right? Some organisms die, some organisms don't die, okay? Okay, you walk off a cliff, a tree falls on you. Okay, that crap happens. Okay, you get lucky and do breed. Okay, there is some randomosity to nature. Okay, there is no doubt about this. So to some degree, there is random shifts in populations. Okay, when this changes the way a population looks physically or acts physically, okay? So like the example we have here, we went from having a pretty good mix-ish, okay, or we had two phenotypes, okay, red and white, to having only red okay, by random chance. There's no benefit to being red or white flower. Okay, just white flowers had a bad day. Okay, no bees came by and buzzed on them. Okay. That kind of random genetic drift is really only going to happen if the population is very small. Okay, you can imagine it's very unlikely in a population of 1,000 flowers that no white flowers are chosen by the bees. Okay, but you can imagine in a population of 5 flowers that one white flower maybe has a bad day, and now there are no white flowers. Hey, girl. Okay, but it does happen. Okay, and certainly on a smaller scale, a white flower or 5 white flowers may just die. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit more about things like contingencies, organisms just dying because they're in the wrong place at the wrong time. Okay, what we're going to spend more time focused on, though, is natural selection. Okay, because this is an ecology class, and we are more interested in what happens when we're tied to the environment. And this is why natural selection is so important, because this is the only one that has a mechanism that sets this up in a way that matches environmental conditions or pressures. Okay, so whatever you end up with, this is where you end up with something that is adaptive, or you end up with a new adaptation, right? Something that will benefit your population in the future. Okay, so if we use our example on this side, okay, we think about the basic concept of natural selection. Things that are living get to breed, things that are dead don't. Right? That is the fundamental core of how natural selection works. So if we look at the example we have over here, okay, we have the ferocious bird oppressors, okay, going out and feeding on these bugs. Okay. Given the bar we have, okay, green beetles are easier to spot than chartreuse beetles. Okay. Most organisms are going to go for the easy meal. I know I do. DoorDash is easier than cooking. Okay. So the birds are going to go out and pick out whatever's easiest, okay, which in this case is the green beetle. Okay, so the green beetles are more likely to die. Sucks to be a green beetle. Orange beetles are more likely to survive. Okay, the things that live get to live, breed, and have babies. Okay, when you have babies, the babies tend to look like you. Okay. When you're dead, you just don't have babies. That's all there is to that. All right? So when you breed and have babies, you have things that look like you. There just are more things that look like you. When you're dead, there just aren't things that look like you because you're dead. All right? So over time, there are more orange beetles that have lived because they've blended in, so it takes the bird longer to find them. They're more likely to live, less likely to be eaten, more likely to breed. The green beetles are more likely to be dinner. All right. So this is the general core. Dead things don't have babies. Okay. As we're going to find, okay, this process drives the way things look in very specific directions. And we're going to look at that in pieces. Okay, so you don't always just end up with one choice in a population. Right? It's not always, now instead of green, you have orange. And that's sort of intuitive to us, right? Okay. So the first thing we want to look at is directional selection. That's what we just looked at, right? We went from green to orange. All right, so this is what we mean by directional. Okay. In other words, you have, if we think about beak size here, some sort of pressure, environmental pressure, that's going to shift our phenotype from one way to another. So if we had, for example, heavy nuts, I'm not going to put big, I'm going to put heavy, on the island, okay, our finches or our birds population probably had a wider variety of beak sizes, right? But, okay, as they were trying to crack these heavier nuts, something you might picture something like a walnut or a Brazil nut, right? I hate cracking Brazil nuts. Those things are impossible to get into. Okay, the birds with the smaller beaks would have been unlikely or less likely to be able to get into these nuts. So they starve. Poor birds. Okay, you starve to death, you don't breed, you don't have babies with little teeny fiddly beaks, right? Okay. If you're a bird with a big old chonker of a beak, okay, you would not have a hard time at all cracking into these nuts. Right? You pick one up and you're basically a nutcracker. Okay? So you would be able to break into these heavy nuts no problem. Okay? You'd be the king of nuts. You'd be fat and glorious. Okay? Ladybirds be flocking to your chunky butt. Okay? Okay, you get to live and breed and have many birdie babies that also have chunky beaks. Okay, as a result, over time, there are going to be more birds alive with chunky beaks. Okay, and fewer birds that live with small fiddly beaks because they all died by starving to death. Nobody wants to breed with the scrawny bird who's clearly not getting enough food, right? We all ignore the weird scraggly bird in the corner. Okay, so this is the idea behind directional selection. Whatever pressure is going on is going to move things one way or the other. It's not always bigger. It could be smaller. Does that make sense? Okay. Can't draw when you do that. Disruptive selection. Okay. So here's an option. This is one we haven't probably talked about in any classes before. But this would be an option where whatever's going on, okay, you're going to see divergence in sizes. Okay, so let's go back to our island. Okay, so maybe on our island we have two food resources. We have our heavy nuts still. Okay, so we understand where this hump comes from, right? So we still get that hump. Okay, we got our big, chonky beak nutcracker bearbs. They live in their best life. Okay? But we also have trumpet flowers. Okay, and these are like the long flowers. Let's see. I'm stuck with my artwork now. You often see like hummingbirds get into. You need like the long fiddly beak. Okay, so in order to get into trumpet flowers, Okay, you have to have a really small beak. If your beak is too big, you destroy the flower. Okay, and then you don't get any nectar, and the poor flower is dead. And then you're just not popular in the bird community. Okay, so if you're in the middle here, right, you can't do anything. Right, you can't crack a nut because your beak is too small. So you're an ineffective nutcracker. But you can't get into the flowers because your beak is too big. All right, and it destroys the flower and you're ineffective at getting nectar. Okay, so being in the middle there sucks. Okay, but if your beak is very, very small, then you can get nectar. And if your beak is very, very big, then you can get nuts. Okay. We see this a lot in fisheries or in fishes. Okay, if you're very, very small, then nobody wants to eat you because you're not interesting, right? You're not a worthy prey source. And if you're very, very big, then usually you're too big to eat, right? Other animals can't actually get their mouth around you. And so you see this disruptive selection because being the Goldilocks fish means you're just right for eating, okay? So you see fish being very, very small or very, very big. And they are very, very loud. Okay, this one makes sense? Any questions so far? Okay, the last one is the least common. This is called stabilizing selection, and this happens on rare occasions. Okay, in this case, okay, and the best example here is something like human birth weight. Okay, we're actually right now seeing evolution against this, but commonly in birth weight, for example, either extreme has negative effects. Okay, so if we think about human birth weight, for example, from the baby's perspective, okay, a low birth weight is bad, right? Being a teeny, teeny baby, you're more likely to die. Okay. However, right, this can't be directional selection because from mom's perspective, okay, a really, really, really big baby is bad because then mom is more likely to die. Okay, right? So stabilizing selection is the Goldilocks. Okay, there's this perfect sweet spot that says at this point, okay, is where you need to be. Okay, a lot of mammals have this. Okay, birth weight is the most common example of this. Humans are actually moving away from this because C-sections are so common that we're actually moving more towards directional selection here than we are stabilizing, but most other mammals use this. Okay, giraffe neck length works a bit like this too. Right? The longer your neck, the more competitive you can be for getting food, but there's a negative to how long your neck is because you have to pump blood out there and all of those features as well. So you can't just have an infinitely long neck and just be the best giraffe in all of Africa. Okay, these three features make sense. Okay, So now let's look at our types of selection themselves. So natural selection, and then we're going to look at some of the other types. Okay, so what does it take for natural selection to actually happen? Okay, so this is probably a little bit of a review, but for some of you, maybe an old many moons ago kind of review. Okay, so the first thing you need is variation for natural selection to occur, right? In other words, something for natural selection to act upon. Okay? You could have all of the environmental pressures in the world, okay, the fiercest lions, okay, the coldest winters, but if everybody in your population has the exact same phenotypes, so the same thickness of fur, okay, the same length of legs, nothing's going to change, right? Okay, because there's no differential deaths. Okay, everybody is as likely to die. Okay, so you don't have the green and the orange beetle. Everybody's just green, everybody's as equally likely to die. So you need to have the green and the orange beetle to begin with. Okay, the chonky and the skinny beak. Just gonna pop out for a hot second and make sure. Okay, the first thing is we have a population and they have variation. Okay, so we have our green and our orange beetles. So there's a difference in our genotype and phenotype, right? Okay, and that is heritable. Okay, so we have to be able to pass this on to the next generation. Otherwise, we would reset every generation. So remember, the idea here is if you live, right, you have babies that look like you. And so the underlying key feature here is that whatever thing it is, the fact that I am orange, okay, is a feature that I can pass on to my offspring. I am also having orange babies. Okay, so that means that my orangeness is a genetic component. Okay, it's my genotype. If my orangeness is because I fell in a mud puddle, so now I'm just covered in orange clay, okay, that's still going to give me an advantage, right? I'm still camouflaged really well, but I can't pass on being covered in mud to my baby beetles. Okay, so that is not a heritable component. So whatever it is that I have has to be heritable. I like this blue. Are they just like picking stuff up and dropping it? Okay, feel good? So now we have two things that we need. Okay, there has to be some sort of variation, and whatever that variation is, that thing needs to be heritable. I need to be able to pass it on to my offspring. Okay, lastly, okay, is this idea of fitness. Okay. And so this is a big word that breaks down relatively simply. And that basically means that whatever variation we have, that variation needs to matter. Okay. And it matters very specifically towards some sort of competition or survival concept, right? And so remember, the idea here is that life is tough. This is what this comes down to. Life is tough. And so when you're out there in the big bad world, there's a lot of inequality for survivorship and inequality for reproduction. Okay? You can't be a winner at everything. So whatever variation that you have, has to give you some kind of an advantage at something. Okay, and that something needs to fall under what I call the 3 S's. I'm drawing here. Rude. Okay. The first S is survivorship. My R's and B's look the same. I'm sorry. Okay. So literally just not death. Okay. So this is pretty intuitive. I am more likely to survive because I'm camouflaged. Okay, that's like the beetle example we've been working on, right? I am more likely to survive because I can run faster. Okay. Whatever it might be, I'm just literally less likely to be eaten. Okay. I'm not going to die. More likely to survive longer. Okay, bite me, lion. Or don't bite me, quite literally. Oh man, that was funny. Okay, number 2, sustenance. Yep, I can spell that. This is fine. Okay, the obtaining of shelter and goods that you need. Okay, so I am more competitive at getting nuts, okay, or building a nest. Okay, I'm better at fighting for the best plot of land. Okay. Whatever it is that you need, okay, for your daily living expenses, you're more competitive at getting them. These are like my kryptonite on those screens, man. Okay. And lastly, sex. Okay. More likely to attract organisms of the opposite sex. Okay. This is usually coloration. Okay. This can be also nest decoration. Okay. The ability to call or dance. Okay. This might be more hidden stuff, right? Gamete fitness, for example. As long as it's apparent enough to make you more fit in garnering mates and garnering offspring. All right, so my 3 S's. Okay, that sums up what fitness says. Okay, so variation has to matter and give you an advantage in one or more of those things. And you can imagine that there's some overlap there. Okay, this makes up natural selection. okay, which works in any of those three ways we just discussed: directional, disruptive, and stabilizing. Okay. Does natural selection as a whole make sense? Okay. So we just got done talking about sex, so let's talk about sexual selection. Because while it fundamentally follows all of the same rules, it is a little bit different. Sexual selection is a cruel mistress. Okay? So it needs all the same pieces, variation and inheritance, but its fitness piece is a little nasty. Okay? So its fitness piece obviously is based solely for sex, right? Okay. The singular goal of attracting another of the same species. Okay. Now here's where this gets dirty and cruel. Okay. Things that may attract someone from the same species, not always something that's going to make you more competitive at surviving. Wow, surviving. Right? So, for example, we take our little peacock here. Okay? Lady peacock, love that. Okay? That is a sexy bird. Okay? And this is some runaway sexual selection. Right? So, peahens don't look like this. Y'all ever seen a peahen? They some boring girls. Nah. Okay? And this is how this business goes. So the idea is we're just going to try to attract lady peahens. This is some unfair business, right? So this is a female peahen. Not the most dazzling thing you've ever seen. If you've ever seen a bird of paradise, it's the same sort of business here. But the peacock, right, the male of the species, goes to extreme lengths to attract her. So they have these enormous tails that are extraordinarily colored, right? And then they do this like insane dance where they tip it forward and okay? Very good for getting a lady. Okay? Not super great for the whole not dying business, right? Okay, because they're literally screaming like, "Not me!" Okay? They're super brightly colored, and these things weigh up to 10 pounds. Okay? Clear the runway for takeoff. So the likelihood of being able to escape a predator is significantly lower for a male than it is for a female. Okay? And males that are more likely to attract females, so they're more brightly colored, they have heavier and longer tails, and they scream louder, are more likely to get picked off by a predator. So in some cases, sexual selection actually goes in the opposite direction of natural selection. Now, this isn't always the case, right? There are plenty of species where females just like males that are not stupid. Okay, we can think of something like a lion. They just like to pick the biggest male who's the meanest and is more likely to not die and can protect them. Those situations, that lion, sexual selection and natural selection are going in the same direction. His life is easy. Situations like the peacock, he's got a rough go. Okay? So sexual selection is a cruel mistress for some organisms. Okay? So you need to be really careful when you're picking out what exactly is the driver for sexual selection and what exactly is the driver for natural selection. They don't always go in the same direction. And as the organism looking for sexual selection, it's not always a balance that goes in their favor, but they usually go in the direction of sexual selection. Right? Pass on your genes, be immortal, live your best and shortest life. Any questions about that? Okay. Why would we not expect the females to also be brightly colored? I mean, female choice is a thing. What else do the females do, though? They carry the eggs and sit on the nests, right? And so that's another reason that we tend to see the females as more drab, as they sit on the nests more. Okay, good job. So the last thing we're going to talk about is artificial selection, which is the last major type of selection. So artificial selection is fundamentally super similar to the way natural selection works, except the selection process isn't based on environmental pressures, right? It's literally artificially chosen. Okay? So instead of it being a predator that's saying, I'm choosing the green ones because they're easier to pick off, so the orange ones, okay, are left alive to breed, and you breed things that look like you. Okay, now we have humans are choosing and saying, well, I like the puppies that don't bite versus the puppies that do bite. And we're not usually, well, sometimes, okay, killing them off per se, but allowing them to breed, or actively breeding the sweet puppies, or the fluffy puppies, right? Or the brown puppies, or the puppies with the curly tails, or the ones with the short legs, or whatever it is that you want to happen, so you end up with the smooshed-faced dogs. So you're actively choosing only smooshed-faced dogs. Okay, so instead of orange beetles, we're choosing smooshed-faced dogs to breed. Okay, so by only breeding smooshed-faced dogs, okay, so we start with a big population of dogs, long-nosed and smooshed-faced dogs. Okay, so every generation, we take out the smooshed-faced dogs and we only breed the smooshed-faced dogs. Okay, so then every generation, we get more and more smooshed-faced dogs, and the dogs have more smooshier faces. Okay, and you end up with that, like, what are they, like bulldogs or whatever, and look, real smushed, jowly look. People are into that, right? I'm a cat person, and my cat's kind of a trash goblin, so this is a little out of my league, but I know this is a thing. Okay, so all the concepts are the same. You still need the variation in there. Okay, that variation, okay, still needs to be heritable. Right, you need to be able to pass on the smooshed facedness. Okay, so the only component's a little different is the fitness. Okay, we're deciding what the key components are, and it's not necessarily healthier for them, right? Smooshed facedness, in fact, causes like respiratory problems and disease, but we like it because it's cute, so we kept it. Some of the things were beneficial, like if we think of like a terrier, okay, we bred that in because they were able to dig rats out of English gardens back in the 1600s, so terriers existed. It's not necessarily a environmentally fit trait, but we thought it had a benefit that was beyond stubby, adorable legs. Okay, this feel good? Okay. Any questions about any of the selection terms that we've talked about? Not that we can. Really? There we go. Okay. So we are just going to start talking about these relationships then. And there's a few terms I want to start talking about first that we need to get under about before we start looking at what you need to do your frog assignment. Okay. The first of which is constraint. Okay, so as we think about what the relationships are between organisms, we can't have, and the reasons we don't have sort of an infinite type of organisms on the planet in all of history is because there is some intuitively constraint on what types of organisms can exist. Right, so if we think about natural selection, directional selection, right, we can get birds getting chunkier beaks, easier and easier to crack nuts, right? But eventually there's a constraint on how big that beak can be, right? It can't be so big that the bird starts to like tip over forward. It becomes too difficult to carry, it becomes too difficult to open, right? You need too big of a muscle for that bird's head. Okay, so this is what we mean by constraint, okay? Some sort of limitation to what type of size, okay, or body type an organism could have. Okay, so we think quite literally of like the pig with wings. Okay, we couldn't, for example, have a pig with wings because a pig is too heavy. So even if a pig could develop wings, it's not like it could fly. And one of the reasons birds are so successful is because they have hollow bones. Okay, we remember, those of you that took zoology with me, we talk about you can hold a falcon on your arm because they're very lightweight. We have all those hollow bones. Falcon's about the same size as a small bulldog. You could not, in fact, hold a bulldog on your arm because they're little chunkinas, right? They're quite heavy. Okay, that's the same kind of idea. You couldn't put wings on a bulldog and expect him to fly. So these are examples of constraints. Okay. So our chonky bird beak, our flying bulldog, right? Flying pigs. These are all issues that we run into that stop us from making sort of these infinite number of combinations, or right, why don't we just have a bird that could crack any nut? Well, because the bird's head would fall off, right? That's ultimately problematic for the bird. So this is what constraint means. Okay. We'll go ahead and stop there today. Okay. We'll talk about exploding volcanoes on Monday. Y'all need to get some sleep. Okay. The weather tonight is going to be perfect. Get some relaxation in. I think it's literally going to be like 60 with no humidity. So at the very least, maybe sleep with the window open, right?